Okay, so the title for this talk has changed slightly just to make it a little less wordy, but I'm dealing with the same issues that were laid out in the abstract. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Race Equality Charter Initiative across the higher education sector. I'm going to tell you about what REC is, explain what it is, what it comes out of, so the kind of like socio-political context in which REC has emerged, what it claims to do for the sector and how, and also think about some of the ways that it's currently being applied within higher education institutions. But before I do that, I want to just give you some facts and figures from 2018, which Silhouette's already kind of touched upon, but I can reiterate. So 22% of all UK students are from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. There's been a 60% growth since 2003-04. So that's pretty kind of like good on the surface level, looking at those numbers. But those students tend to be overrepresented in so-called less prestigious institutions that are less research intensive. And also, once they get into university, they're not getting the same gains as white students from their financial investment in education. So there's quite a stark attainment gap of 13.6% between white BME students, UK students, and this attainment gap becomes even wider when you start to break down the groups by different ethnicities. So the gap stretches to between 20 and 25% when we look at the difference between black African and black Caribbean students and their white counterparts. So that kind of number hides some of the more kind of tragic numbers that we're seeing. So 9.4% of all UK staff in higher education institutions are BME. That number is slightly smaller when we take account of all the academic staff within our institutions. That stands at 6.7%. We all know this kind of number now, I think. It was a total, last time I checked, there were a total of 86 black professors in the UK, or 0.6% of the professoriate. And BME staff, once they're in, are more likely to leave their institution than white staff. Okay, so what is the Race Equality Charter? So the Race Charter seeks to encourage institutions to self-reflect on some of these issues mentioned by using available data that they have relating to representation and outcomes for their staff and students of colour. It was introduced in 2016 after a pilot in 2014 by the Equality Challenge Unit, which is now part of Advanced HE. It's very similar to the Athena Swan Charter. It's modelled on the Athena Swan Charter, which was introduced in 2005 to encourage gender equality in STEM staff. STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths, I think. So institutions are expected to become a member first to the programme and then must apply for an award within 3 years of joining, so the clock starts ticking as soon as you become a member. You can currently apply for either a bronze or a silver award. It goes up to gold, but we're very far from, I don't think any institution across the country is anywhere near applying for gold. And the awards that you get need to be renewed every 3 years. So you can't just get the award and say, I've got a bronze and that's it. You have to work towards renewing it every 3 years. So the REC, I'm going to call it the REC from now on, the Race Equality Charter, requires kind of institutions to put together small self-assessment teams within the university, and they're expected to develop a report on institutional issues and action plans to address those issues. And then they send that application off to Advanced HE, which was Equality Challenge Unit, for assessment. So there are currently only 59 member institutions, and I have a couple of hundred in the UK, and 12 of those hold an award. Okay, so I'm going to get my iPad out now. So, since a big theme of this conference is to reflect on the progression we've made since the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, I want to try and put the Race Equality Charter within this longer historical context to think about how it fits into higher education's handling of race equality through time. So the inquiry and the subsequent McPherson report in 1999 highlighted the endemic racism in British society, and importantly, it put the country's institutions in the spotlight. The Race Relations Amendment Act 2000 formed in its legacy. This legislation put duty on public bodies to promote race equality. So universities were of course implicated by this, and through the 2000s, the publication of race equality policies were not hard to come by across the sector. and professional equality and diversity practitioners and departments grew to support this work. However, the promotion of equal opportunities and diversity agendas at that time were criticised by some in the academy as being a liberal approach that centred diversity agendas and diluted the real issues at stake, which are social justice and anti-racism. Okay, so fast forward to 2010, and the introduction of the Equality Act brings different equality strands into one single act, which again Silhouette mentioned in her talk. So through the 2010s, you see less external government pressure to do specifically race equality. And this is exacerbated within the context of developments like the 2012 hostile environment, which drove the expansion of UK borders and border enforcers, including into places like higher education. And of course, the 2015 counter-terrorism legislation, which oppressed civil liberties in the name of security. So institutions around this time, therefore, have been actually key agents in enforcing and reproducing ethnic inequality rather than tackling those issues. But from around kind of 2015, there's been increasing critiques of higher education, most explicitly through global and national student movements, which have been key to making problems within the sector attract public attention. So you think about Rose Must Fall, decolonising the curriculum, racism on campus has been highlighted by national media outlets. And there's been a gradual shift in focus from widening participation initiatives and discourses around that to more talk about attainment gaps or rewarding gaps. And increasingly, the deficit model, which historically too often blames students of colour for their supposed underachievement at degree level, has been critiqued and replaced with an analysis of how it is in fact the institutions that are failing our students. Okay, so the Race Equality Charter is both a product of this political moment and also is potentially a mechanism to help drive its continuation. It comes at a time when there's increasing pressure on the universities to care about race equality issues and provides a good opportunity for self-reflection across the sector. So, is the Race Equality Charter an attempt to bring the institution back into focus? And that's kind of what I'm going to think about in the rest of the talk. So it's helpful first to think about some of the kind of theoretical and political drivers behind the initial introduction of the Race Equality Charter in 2014. So writing in the Aiming Higher Runnymede report in 2015, which is a collection of kind of pieces by academics and policymakers that cover topics to do with race, inequality and diversity in the academy. Gary Loke, who was then who is still part of Advanced HE, which was then the Equality Challenge Unit, stated, "The REC requires senior leaders to publicly acknowledge and discuss racial inequalities within their institution and to commit to tackling them. Reputational risk is lowered by institutions doing this collectively rather than one institution doing so alone. It requires institutions to facilitate frank, honest dialogue about race and ethnicity. It provides a systematic and cross-institutional approach which seeks to promote collaborative efforts which are embedded across the institution. It facilitates collaboration between participating institutions so that the issues are openly discussed and good practice is shared across the sector." So what I want to do in the rest of the presentation is think about how these kind of initial plans for the REC are actually being applied in some of the institutions that I've gone into, and whether or not the Race Charter lives up to some of these initial intentions as laid out in this quote. And I'm specifically going to think about the bits that are highlighted in green. So the extracts are taken from 17 interviews with members of 6 universities, staff at Advanced HE, and also some observations of EDI committee meetings. So, okay. So the first point here, so that's that first green bit. Senior leaders, it requires senior leaders to publicly acknowledge and discuss racial inequalities within their institution and commit to tackling them. So there were mixed accounts of senior leadership report within the institutions, but across all of the accounts, it was clear that support from senior management was very important, quite obviously, to the success of the Race Equality Charter agenda within an institution, especially when this support was done in a meaningful way. So Corinne told me I was the first person appointed with a remit to look at equality and diversity in this university at senior level. The Vice-Chancellor was my direct line manager. If I needed anything done, I would go and see him, and that made a big difference. I persuaded him to include equality and diversity as one of the review parameters for faculty. So we were reviewing teaching excellence, research excellence, and things like that. There was also always a section on equality and diversity. And what that meant was that faculties and schools had to report on their equality data. So where people were positioned within the organisational structure in the university was often mentioned in other interviews, where the lines of communication to those in decision-making roles were strong, as in the case of Kareem, REC actions were likely to be prioritised. However, many working on the REC expressed a disappointment in what they deemed to be empty commitments by senior management. So Zara told me, "You've got a lot of senior white people on the self-assessment team that I've never seen in a meeting. I've never met, ever, in 2 years, but their names are on the application. Didn't get any feedback on the submission, on the action plan from them, and they're having to put their name to it because they know it's the right thing to do, rather than genuinely wanting to do it." These are people who hold vital positions in the university, and people who, if they were paying attention, they could really help shift things faster, so much faster. And much of the concerns about lack of institutional commitment was often related to the perceived lack of accountability for targets in the action plans not being met or meaningfully worked towards. So Ishmael explained to me, "I guess there's a commitment to the race charter to keep it going, but I don't think it's very high on the agenda. Officially, we have targets for representation of BME, senior academics and senior administration, which we are supposed to achieve, but then if we don't achieve them, nothing really happens. There's no consequence, no accountability, which makes it very difficult to put it high on the agenda." What was interesting though is that across many of the accounts, the institutional fear of losing the award once you had that award, so for those institutions that actually had a bronze award, it provided impetus to work harder towards doing the work to keep it. So this was kind of indicative of how the REC might provide institutions with a benchmark and a baseline for their race equality work and act as a buffer against any slippage below the bronze level award criteria they have achieved. So it's kind of like, I guess, thinking about the reputational damage that might happen if you then lose that award. That in and of itself was a driver to kind of encourage commitment to keeping it. So in that way, it's kind of like a badge of honour, so to speak. So institutions wanted to make sure they kept their awards. Okay, so this second green bit, it provides a systematic and cross-institutional approach which are embedded across the institution. So many people we spoke to suggested that there was little to no cross-institutional connected approaches that implemented the Race Equality Charter plans and targets. Instead, there tended to be lots of pockets of good interventions. So examples of this included hires to decision-making committees after data audits for the REC showed little to no people of colour represented. So David told me, there's lots of good... David's highlighting the issue in the title. Forget David, I've gone past David. Daniel told me. Sorry, David. Doing the Race Equality Charter, we looked at decision-making committees across the university, across the different faculties, and there was a severe lack of people of colour in any of those committees. Literally one faculty, I think there was one person of colour across the whole institution. So I think there's been some acknowledgement of that, and we have seen some changes, and we can look at and point to a number of committees where we have seen changes be made as a result of the Race Equality Charter. So there were also examples of changes to recruitment practices. So Clive explained, in order to address the disproportionate representation of BME staff at senior levels, one of the things we did was basically implement the simultaneous advertising of roles, both internally and externally. It's worth noting that this is for professional services jobs. Because before, roles had to be advertised internally first, and then we would go external. So what was happening, we were basically then recruiting from the same depleted gene pool. So the problem was not solved. So one of the things we did was advertise our roles internally and externally at the same time, so as to encourage more external applicants. But this was something that we did in the library. It wasn't something that was done institutionally. So other examples of kind of these pockets of intervention included student ambassador projects, the appointment of staff of colour into senior faculty positions, specifically as like vice deans for equality and diversity, to look at these kind of rec issues, changes to reading lists and programme modules, so things like this. These are some of the changes that we could see. And these were obviously all very positive actions that came off the back of kind of people's involvement in producing the Race Equality Charter action plans and looking at their data. But they tended to be viewed as kind of piecemeal approaches to the issues, which goes against the embedded strategic approaches that the Race Equality Charter intended for institutions to embark on. So, I'm going to be finished soon actually, so that's quite good. So, Joe explained, Richard, man, you throw me a little bit.
That's what I do.
No, I'm fine. Joe summed up the weaknesses of approaching the Race Equality Charter with weak and disconnected action plans, which are not written into kind of broader institutional trajectories and strategies. So he explained what was happening in his institution around the Race Equality Charter action plans. So he said, I think an action plan is as strong as the people in the community that are building it. I've seen some really weak action plans that are kind of 50 pages long, focus on everything. We're going to change pictures of people, a couple of pictures so we look more diverse. We're going to completely change how we recruit. And that kind of scale, simultaneously micro, macro, it's not strategic, it doesn't focus or spread over the institution with very little accountability. So weak plan is weak because it's just unmanageable. There's so much to do around race equality in higher education for students and staff that it can just get so big you don't know where to start. So what we've done with our action plan is to work out what's going to have the biggest impact in the quickest time. So we've got 4 key issues that we're targeting over 4 years that we're going to change. So these are kind of my, I guess, like kind of loose conclusions. But I guess I'm halfway into kind of thinking about the analysis, so you know, it's open for kind of discussion. And I know some of you in here will be involved in doing the race chart about your own institutions. So if you want to kind of paint a slightly more positive picture, then please feel free to share those with me.
Can I just ask a question, if that's all right? Is it just to do with higher education you're going to be talking about?
Yeah. So keeping Joe's comments in mind, I want to think about how you know, institutions or people have suggested you turn pockets of intervention into more kind of important institutional strategies and some of the suggestions that have been made. So I don't want to kind of, academics and whatever, researchers often point out all the problems without really thinking about solutions. That's what we do, sorry. So I'm going to try and think about some of the solutions and suggestions that were made. So many ideas are bounced around in the interviews. Some of those were more specifically related to internal practices that might help build an accountability, such as making equality, diversity, and inclusion targets and progression part of kind of middle management performance and development reviews, and also building major targets and action points from the Race Equality Charter action plans into institutional KPIs, which we've seen some institutions do already. Others talked about the need for sector-wide changes to increase the regulation of teaching and learning standards through mechanisms like inspection. So it's a bit like Ofsted-like, and I'm sure lots of you in here don't love Ofsted. But teaching in universities is a bit kind of rogue. People kind of do what they want in their curriculum. Academics literally teach how they want to teach. So the point of kind of inspections, I guess, would allow advanced HE to check if institutions are actually doing what they say that they're doing. And participants also expected that inclusivity and race equality training should be further embedded into academic staff inductions and teaching accreditations, which new academics who are finishing PhDs and coming into jobs in higher education are increasingly expected to have as a standard. So the Higher Education Academy, which is a branch of Advanced HE, administers these teaching standards. And so they're well placed to forge these links with the Race Equality Charter plans or requirements. And finally, the role of external stakeholders were also discussed. Many suggested that the REC should be tied to research funding as Athena Swan was. We'll talk about, if you can ask about that in a bit. I didn't really explain that, sorry. So the point would be then that Advanced HE, or we lobby UK funding councils to make the move and say to higher education institutions, to get funding for research from us, you need to show that you have a Race Equality Charter award. And that's what's kind of happened with Athena Swan and gender initiatives. But there were lots of doubts about this happening in reality. People didn't think there'd be a champion in the kind of in amongst the research funding councils to really move that forward in relation to race equality. Gender is kind of seen as a bit of an easier thing to tackle, but race, people were quite pessimistic about a champion coming forward and doing that. This is the final point. And there were also suggestions that there should be more meaningful attachments made to other initiatives within the sector that higher education institutions are being asked to comply with, and attachments to stakeholders in the sector who have a little more influence really over institutions than the Race Equality Charter does and Advanced HE. This was seen as an important method for helping the Race Equality Charter and race equality issues more generally gain traction and uptake. So I'm thinking about harmonisation with the Office for Students, access and participation plans were mentioned, alongside more meaningful links with the race research excellence framework and the teaching excellence framework. Not everyone's from higher education sector here, so you might not understand what any of that means at the end, that last point, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. I think that's it, I'm done.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Karis.